Hi, I'm Paul Leung, and I presently teach at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. I just want to, first of all, thank you for tuning in to this webcast. I am especially thankful for the Project Empowerment, and they're inviting me to share a few of my thoughts with you today. There's nothing really new about what I'm going to say, nor anything really revolutionary as such. But I did want to share, I think, perhaps some perspectives that maybe I think we need to look at as we move forward into the future, especially as related to vocational rehabilitation. But before I actually get into the presentation itself, I just want to highlight a couple of things, and I hope that you will indulge me in this process. The first is that as I'm taping this is Black History Month. And I'm particularly mindful of the past because I think that it's especially important for us to recognize and acknowledge those individuals that went before us, because they really have paved the way for us to do the kinds of things that we are able to do today. This is true in vocational rehab as it is true in other areas of life as well. The past does affect the present. And as this slide suggests, we reach back in our ability to move forward. Just as an example, I remember a person who assisted me a great deal in the past, Dr. Sylvia Walker, who for the longest period of time was the director of a research and training center at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And her philosophy was always that we do what is good for the person with disability from a diverse background. And that's the bottom line, and that's the reason why we're here. By the way, Dr. Walker was Black, and she also was blind, and she was also a woman. Quite obviously, she had many things going against her, but she succeeded, and she brought many people along the journey as a result. This slide is a sort of a personal introduction. I was born in the year of the snake, and this is in the middle of the Lunar New Year, or as some of you know, maybe Chinese New Year. So happy 2013, the year of the snake. I think this particular slide suggests perhaps a metaphor that we can use for my presentation this morning. A snake, for it to grow, must shed its skin. And sometimes I think we have to shed our skin if we are to move forward, just like the snake. The interesting thing I found out was in looking at what goes on when a snake sheds its skin is that not only does it allow for growth, but it also removes some parasites that are found in the old skin. And maybe part of what I have to say is that not only are we going to grow or hope to grow, but that maybe we will also lose some things that may be detrimental as well. Now, going into the presentation itself, I've titled it Challenges Facing Vocational Rehabilitation Research. And basically, I'm going to try to talk with you about four things. One thing, obviously, is disparity. and acknowledge exactly what we're talking about when we talk about disparity. Number two, I hope to revisit evidence-based practices, especially for vocational rehabilitation of groups that have not been served well by vocational rehabilitation. Three, look at maybe different or new or revisit research models that are more relevant perhaps than some of the ways that we have looked at knowledge in the past. And four, the need to increase those folks that are researching and who come from diverse backgrounds. And that obviously includes the process of mentorship. Let me begin by looking at the definition of what disparity involves. This is the Institute of Medicine definition. Obviously doesn't necessarily reflect vocational rehabilitation directly, but indirectly I think there really helps us in understanding what we're talking about. So disparity defined in medicine is differences in care that result from biases, prejudices, stereotyping, and uncertainty in clinical communication and decision making. The Institute of Medicine goes on to say that racial or ethnic differences in the quality of health care that are not due to access-related factors or clinical needs, preferences, and appropriateness of intervention. And then it goes on from that to the fact that we're talking about disparities that are really the result of biases, prejudices, and stereotyping and uncertainty. I think we can make that jump to vocational rehabilitation fairly quickly. We are talking about differences in vocational rehabilitation outcomes that are due to biases, prejudices, stereotyping, and uncertainty in communication and decision making. I think there's a whole literature out there that suggests that we have some of these things going on in vocational rehab and the need for us to pay attention to them. I will come back to this in a couple of minutes. I just want to review a couple of things before we go further. This is the estimate of what our population in the United States is going to look like in 2050 versus what it looked like a few years ago in 2010, which is the last time that we had a complete census. If you notice, the white non-Hispanic population has decreased by almost 20%. The Hispanic population, which is really not necessarily a race, but more of an ethnicity. It is arbitrary, I'll grant you that, has increased 100% to 30% of the total population. And then you look at the African American non-Hispanic population, they have dropped a little bit, but essentially the same. And then you look at the Asian American population, you can see that they have increased, again, almost twice from 4.5% to 7.6%. This is a picture, this is a demographic of our future. Unfortunately, these are not representative, or maybe, hopefully it will be representative, but at present not representative of those people that are being served by vocational rehabilitation. This next slide is also part of what I think we need to keep in mind. I know that disability is oftentimes identified in different ways depending on whose definition we use. But the summary is here that disability is higher among African Americans than any other group. At the same time, I just want to call your attention to the fact that one statistic there for Asian Americans, a population that I'm particularly familiar with, of Asian Americans is at 12.4%. I don't doubt that this is an accurate percentage. The issue to me is that sometimes these figures may in fact point out some things that mask what the reality may be. There are folks that are like myself who are Asian American, but who are in occupations that are less risk for disability, who have, generally speaking, higher educational levels. And for the most part, these are Asian Americans that have been in this country a while, but they don't reflect the reality of more recent Asian immigrants who come as refugees. And because of the small numbers, overall numbers of Asian Americans, there are percentages of these two groups that are quite different, mask the reality for those groups that are perhaps most in need. And that the basic, I guess, message that I have from this slide is that we need to be careful about how we interpret the data that's in front of us. But at any rate, I think it's important to recognize that disability, for the most part, is still going to be an issue as we look at a changing population. This slide, to me, demonstrates what is at the heart of a question that sometimes we need to look at more in detail and with greater depth. As the Institute of Medicine slides earlier indicate, racial bias, prejudices, and discrimination are what bring about disparity. And for a public program, these are, or should be, not be, present. 1963, President John Kennedy. Simple justice requires that public funds, which is part of what our vocational rehab program is all about, to which all taxpayers of all races contribute, not be spent in any fashion which encourages, entrenches, subsidizes, or results in racial discrimination. And while I may seem a bit critical of vocational rehabilitation, I think it's important to recognize that at the same time, I think we have perhaps, and I've been in a lot of places, a vocational rehabilitation that is really second to none, and that is the envy of many countries as they look forward to the future of what to do and how to react and how to cope with disability in their respective areas. But at the same time, we are Americans and we need to look at how we can improve the system where we live. And I think one of the first things that we need to do is really to look within, to see where we have these biases and prejudices that are seemingly a part of our society, and because vocational rehabilitation is a part of society, continues to exist. And traditionally, this has been an issue. 1938, a publication, the Journal of Negro Education, contained an article by two researchers suggesting that the VR system did not serve blacks, Negroes at that time, very well. 1938. Flash forward to 1980. Bobby Atkins did a dissertation study and tried to get it published in the Journal of Rehabilitation. Same result as 1938. What has been the problem? Why did these disparities continue so long? Simply, again, maybe the failure for us to recognize that these things exist. And I know it's particularly difficult for those of us in rehabilitation counseling who see ourselves as being in the area to assist and work with and help people, that maybe we have and are mirroring the same kinds of biases and prejudices that our society contains. So we need to acknowledge and to deal directly, both from the counselor level, the agency level, and at the highest policy levels. I want to maybe step back a bit now and maybe present something that may or may not be new to some of you. This is a notion that has been discussed in maybe anthropology and certainly in some of the studies of indigenous folks throughout the globe. And this is looking at the process maybe of where we have come from in the past and why it becomes so important for us to maybe change our path in the future. And this is the notion of colonialism and the counter notion of decolonization. Basically, colonialism means that at one time, primarily European nations gained control and sovereignty over large parts of our world. And the basis behind gaining control of these areas, obviously, was economic to a large extent, but also maybe reflected the notion that sometimes we still have, and that is what some have called cultural racism. The sense that the perspective that the European perspective is superior to any other perspective. So in that sense, they took over the political structure of countries, gained political independence so that countries now had to gain independence from their colonizers if they were to become sovereign. They took over their economic structure and self-determination and gained control over resources so that individuals who were already living there had now to go back and fight to get these resources. They even took over and tried to minimize the culture of people that were in these countries. And then the question of, actually maybe even genocide, the extermination, which we have seen numerous examples of by colonial powers. Then the statistical genocide, which is an interesting concept. I came across a study that was done, I don't remember exactly who did it, but this was done by a Native American group. And they indicated that they lacked data because they lumped everybody together with the idea that we don't really need to be aware of one's color or one's race or one's ethnicity in the statistical gathering of information. And what this does to a particular group, such as the Native American, is that it tends to make them or render them invisible. In a sense, this is statistical genocide. And I know the terms are strong and maybe hard to hear, but I think we need to recognize, in fact, that what we need to do perhaps is, in fact, to decolonialize the way that we look at things. In other words, no longer can one perspective be seen as superior to another perspective. By extension, the following of the colonial European model, by extension, moves that those who have been in power here in our country also perhaps harbor assumptions about how things should be that may not necessarily reflect the reality of what is out there. So this notion of colonialism and the need for decolonizing the way that we think is in a sense central to the next three areas that I want to maybe spend a few minutes with you about. Currently, one of the most powerful notions about how we practice, whether it be medicine, mental health counseling, or even vocational rehabilitation, is what has been called evidence-based practice, or EBP. Now, essentially, it's not something that is foreign to many of you. This slide shows some of the steps that go into this practice, and I don't think any of us would have any argument about this process. Ask a question, find the best evidence by looking at the literature, talking with peers, evaluate that evidence, apply that information in your clinical practice, whether it be in counseling or in mental health, how it may work out, how it plays out, and then evaluate whether or not it works or not. This is the evidence-based practice model. But I guess my argument is that we've kind of moved or looked back at the model and maybe made some things a little bit more important than others. This slide has evidence-based practice right there in the center. And this is, more of a summary of a slide than the first one. So there are three basically areas that we look at when we look at evidence-based practice. The first is obviously the clinician, the rehabilitation counselor, the individual expertise of this individual. That counts for something. I mean, again, we do have some evidence that, for example, that the rehabilitation counselor who is trained at the master's level may do better than one who doesn't have a master's degree. Obviously, there are some counselors that are better at this than others. That's one part of the model. The second is, again, best external evidence. And this is evidence that's compiled through studies. Now in vocational rehab may not necessarily be double-blind studies that are done as in medicine. But again, there are numerous kinds of summaries of articles, different ways of looking at evidence and putting it together in usable form as a second part of this model. The third part is patient values. That's interesting because this is the part that's, I think, oftentimes ignored and neglected. If we look at some of the literature on evidence-based practice, most of the stuff seems to center on one aspect, and that is best external evidence. What kinds of studies can we use, the quantity of studies, and who are they about? And I think this is where maybe sometimes we find that we don't have the data for groups that we consider to be smaller or minority groups, that maybe we are lacking, in fact, evidence that suggests that something works for a particular population. And that's partly because we've ignored some of the values and expectations of the folks that we are actually serving. And so the challenges that I think evidence-based practice for minority populations in vocational rehab is that we do need to maintain, first of all, a balance between these three things and recognize that all three are an important part of the equation. That we do need more data, and we need research that really includes the populations of interest, in this case, people that are of minority background, that, as I suggested earlier, may be moving into the majority background soon in our country. I won't go into all the problems associated with trying to include more of these populations, knowing that sometimes it's more difficult to find. Sometimes it may cost more. But I think that as we look at evidence-based practice, we really do need to make sure that we include the populations in questions in terms of the research, that the external data, that we make sure that the individual who is trained for this is able to do it, and finally that the individual that comes to us, their values and expectations are included as well. The next is that, again, utilizing the notion of decolonization, of looking at maybe new research models that face us, especially those of us who work in vocational rehabilitation research. This slide is merely a graphic of the process that most of us follow in the academic setting, where we begin by doing studies, asking questions, come up with certain kinds of research, and then we try to conceptualize this, apply it, and publish it, and disseminate it. It is, again, not anything new and certainly not convoluted to those of you who are in academic settings. But I just want you to keep this slide in mind as we move on later on, that not everyone is familiar with this kind of a process. And in fact, inherent in this process is a need to be able to negotiate it in such a way. And if you're new to the field, these kinds of things are not necessarily put into a handbook. They're not necessarily put in such a way that you can readily find how to process what's important and how others of your peers may or may not see the kinds of things that you're doing as relevant or not relevant. This slide is sort of another way of looking at research and knowledge. It's a contrast between two opposing perspectives. The one that I think most of you, or most of us, and certainly I am more familiar with, because I have, unfortunately or fortunately, as the case may be, been acculturated to a Western approach to development of knowledge. We begin at the top with data, with facts, and we put that together to create our knowledge. But this isn't really the way that most of research has been done throughout history even, and certainly not by folks that are indigenous to many of the areas that we talked about earlier in the colonization process. Their knowledge began with narratives, stories, and myths, their experience. And so knowledge is built on a different perspective. And I think that we maybe have lost sight of this. And this is the reason I mentioned that I thought colonization or decolonization to be a significant arbiter of how we do things. It doesn't mean that one or the other is necessarily right or wrong, but maybe that we can find things that in one model that we may not be able to find in another. Again, I'm posing this as a question that I hope that you will consider, because I'm not sure that we have been able to answer all of the questions that we pose by using only one perspective in the process. Finally, this slide contrasts the differences between Western science, which is again the more European-based model of knowledge, and the traditional native knowledge. And with the idea that, in fact, they're not necessarily at odds with each other. There are, in fact, some common ground that maybe we need to spend some time pursuing as we look at new ways of doing research. Maybe we ought to remember again that our universe is, in fact, unified. That while our body of knowledge, regardless of how you gather it, may be stable, it is still modifiable. It can change, evolve. Again, in terms of cognition, habits of the mind, these things are found in both models. You have to be honest in terms of your inquiry. You have to persevere. And again, you have to bring to the model an open-mindedness. Again, skills and procedures, there are the empirical observations in natural settings, verification, inference, and prediction. And finally, the development of actual knowledge that we can use and apply. Again, I'm not asking that we abandon completely the other approach, but to keep in mind, again, that there may be different ways, new ways, in which we can pursue what is to be applicable, especially to these communities that we term at this time minority communities. Ones in which we have not perhaps done as well in terms of the kinds of services that we provide. The last slide is one that is taken from a nursing journal, and they talk about vulnerable populations. While I kind of cringe, I guess, at the notion of minority populations being vulnerable or more vulnerable. Certainly they are at more risk for certain kinds of things. But again, the center is perhaps where we need to focus. The need that we can dialogue and negotiate. But before we can get to that, sometimes we need to maybe, on the right side of the slide, look at ourselves as researchers. That maybe we need to have more a sense of humility in terms of how we approach things. That maybe we need to listen and observe before we start talking. Maybe we need to recognize the expertise of those that we are researching. And finally, a willingness to include people that we are looking at in our protocols, our aspirations and needs into the research design. Now, yes, we've adopted some of these. NIDR, the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, has had a basic model of participatory research. But I think what we're saying here, it goes really beyond that, much more beyond that, for it to become something that is worthwhile and relevant to the realities that exist in the real world. So the challenge again to vocational rehabilitation research. We need research that is, in fact, culturally competent. Again, we can spend a lot of time looking into what that may or may not mean, but it has to have applicability to a population. Research that is culturally relevant. And I guess my message maybe today is, do our existing models adequately reflect reality? Will our models of research gain the knowledge that populations that we're interested in gain from, have application for? And then the last thing that I want to spend a couple of minutes on is that we really do need to look ahead in terms of why maybe that we haven't been able to get the research that we need. Maybe even why we haven't been able to adopt new models earlier. And that is, in effect, the need to increase our numbers. The numbers of individuals who are interested in researching in these groups that we consider to be minority groups. We need to increase those researchers that, in fact, reflect the population that we're interested in. And that is not easy, the recruitment and retention of researchers. And I know that it is complex and complicated, where research occurs and how it occurs and how it's done. People come into our areas and sometimes they get lost, because we're talking about groups that may not have the background, the experience of what research involves, especially in our academic settings. If you remember the slide that I threw up earlier on the academic process of gaining knowledge. So someone comes in, we've recruited them, and they're interested, they may be of minority background. They really do need to have good mentoring. And I know this has been a topic of project empowerment over and over again. And in a sense, it's really a process of acculturation into an academic research setting. Acculturation in a sense that one doesn't lose the base where one comes from. This particular slide that you see now is basically a slide about where mentor-mentee relationships occur within a setting, the context. Could be a university setting, could be a research setting in a vocational rehabilitation agency. And it looks at mentor characteristics, the mentee characteristics on the right, and looks at that relationship. And it's really not an easy one to process. There are so many variables. And then when you mix in some things that relate to race and ethnicity, it becomes even more complex. And I would even add, the mix of disability as another one that we need to consider, so that the outcome is the acculturation in a sense that one can navigate and move around comfortably in a research setting. This is, I think, where we need some more work. There are a lot of, in fact, I guess, individuals that I know that have tried to do their best in mentoring more junior folks into the system. But at the same time, I think where our problem lies is that the mentorship is totally enveloping in terms of one perspective again, how to fit in rather than how to fit beside, together, in such a way as to allow those things that brought the individual into the system in the first place, those things that I think are sacred, my culture, my family, those things that, perspectives that are in fact important and significant, along with being able to navigate the academic environment, the research environment. Those are the nuances that I think we need to maybe spend more time on. Again, this is, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but it just demonstrates a mentoring relationship model. I mean, I think it's a very general one and one that I think works well. But I think the primary thing is, to keep in mind what is it that you really want to accomplish. And I don't think we always have kept that focus in terms of how we have looked at the mentor-mentee relationships. The final slide relates to cross-race mentoring. I guess the point is we're probably never going to have enough of same-race kinds of mentor-mentee relationships, given how long it has taken. But there are drawbacks, there are barriers, there are difficulties associated with balance, assumptions, all these kinds of things that go into this type of relationship. And this is where I think, again, we need to be very, very careful. So the challenges for increasing VR research numbers in terms of researchers, obviously we need folks that reflect the research groups that we're talking about. We need more researchers who are Hispanic background, who are of Asian background, who are African American, and who are Native American. Again, we need to maybe ensure that research mentoring is, in fact, culturally competent. Again, this is something that is relatively new in our perspective of research mentoring. And then the last notion that I think is a challenge is that we have research acculturation, how to navigate at the same time maintaining those things, those strengths that researchers bring as individuals and as members of a underserved group. So with this, I'm going to end. I want to thank you for your participation, your being a part of this, and I understand that you will have opportunity to ask questions, and I'll try certainly to do my best in answering them. Thank you.